Welcome to today's Wednesday webinar. We're so glad that you are here to focus on the FAFSA. I'm Mila Tappan, and I am the Education Affordability Content and Training Manager. And with me here today is Mary Dyer, and Mary is our Education Affordability and Financial Wellness Manager. Mary is going to be monitoring the questions for today. Today's session is an extended session. It will last 90 minutes. It is being recorded, so if you do need to leave early, if you only had an hour or even less for this, I totally understand that. I will be sending the recording and some additional materials later this week to everybody who registered so that you can catch up or rewatch or share with others. We certainly encourage that. We do ask that you share your questions in the Q&A. That is preferable. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of them in the Q&A. So if you could do that, that would be great. What I will do is I will stop during the session periodically, check in with Mary to see if there are questions that she thinks that we should talk about within the full group. So we'll do that. Any questions we don't get answered today, if there are any, I'll make sure that I do follow up and include them in the email. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about what needs to happen prior to filing the FAFSA for the first time, specifically creating StudentAid.gov accounts. We're going to talk about what it looks like to file a FAFSA under the scenario where the student is a dependent student with the student starting the FAFSA. And then we'll show what happens on the parent side once the student has completed their section. Next, we'll walk through a few other scenarios. We'll just highlight some of the things that are different for independent students. We'll talk about what happens if a parent is unwilling to file the FAFSA. We'll talk about homeless students and students with unusual circumstances and how they navigate the process. Then we'll spend just a couple of moments talking about the FAFSA after it's submitted, what students will be able to see and access, and how they'll make updates. And last but not least, I will share some FAFSA resources that are available on our website and in other locations. So with that, let's go ahead. And I really do want your questions, so please do ask them if you have them. All right, let's start first of all with StudentAid.gov accounts. So creating a StudentAid.gov account, formerly referred to as an FSA ID, StudentAid.gov is moving away from that terminology, so I'm trying to do so as well. I still slip occasionally, but StudentAid.gov accounts are the first step in filing a FAFSA. Accounts are created at StudentAid.gov. Everything federal student aid related now lives under StudentAid.gov. You may recall there was a point in time where the FAFSA lived here, and creating an account lived here, and loan information lived here, but now everything is all under StudentAid.gov. When an account is created, the individual sets up a username and password. So just like any of the multiple sites that we all have, we set up a username and password, and that is how we can access StudentAid.gov. An account is required to access the FAFSA, but also, and to sign it, and also to access all of the other federal student aid processes, and it serves as a legal signature. So for example, if students do borrow any federal student loans, federal student aid is where they will go back to and log in with this same username and password in order to sign a promissory note, in order to do their entrance counseling, to, as they repay their loans, to be able to keep track of them, file for public service loan forgiveness, and all of that. So this account will be used potentially for years and years to come. Now, when creating an account, an individual provides identifying information, including their social security number. So their name, date of birth, and social security number are then matched against the Social Security Administration's database to verify that individual's identity. Now, if you haven't heard yet, one of the very, very great things that they have done recently is that that match is now happening in real time. As long as everything matches up, that account will verify with, the identity will be verified with SSA in real time, meaning the individual will be able to proceed with filing the FAFSA immediately. In the past, it was a 1 to 3 day wait in order for that information to be verified. People could go ahead and start the FAFSA, but we certainly didn't recommend it if they had tax information on file, because if their identity had not been verified, their tax information wouldn't come over. But now we're in a situation where their identity should be verified in real time. If it doesn't verify, it probably means there's something that's not matching with SSA. They can correct it immediately. And then once it is verified, they can go ahead and start the FAFSA. And if they have tax information on file, not everyone files taxes, but if they have tax information on file, it will come over and populate the FAFSA. So we're going to go into more detail about that piece in a moment. But this is really a game changer, because for all of you who have been working with students and maybe doing events, the challenge we had is that we really had to do two steps, right? People had to create their accounts and then wait a couple of days, and then they could do their FAFSA. So if someone showed up at a FAFSA completion session and they hadn't done anything, we couldn't get their FAFSA done typically at that one event. So this is really, really good news. Now, when creating an account, an individual does need a unique email address that can be accessed when creating the account, because it does have to be verified. So they can't just use any email address. They need to use an email address that they have access to at that point in time. We're going to talk about two-step verification in a moment. For students that are high school students or even college students, we recommend that they not use their school address. So for a high school senior, please do not have them create their StudentAid.gov account using their high school email address. That's because they will lose access to their high school email address likely the summer after they graduate from high school. So we need their account, their email account, to be something they have access to ongoingly, so that when they do have to do that two-step verification, they will have access to that email account. So if high school seniors have not already done this, it's a great time to set up a Gmail account or a Hotmail account or a Yahoo account, whichever they would like to use, so that they will have an email account that they will have access to when they're in high school, when they're in college, and thereafter. If you have a student who has already created their account, and they did use their high school email address, that's okay. They can go in back to StudentAid.gov and log in, and under settings, they can update their email address. They can update other information as well. So that is what we would recommend that they do. We also recommend that students provide their cell phone number or their mobile phone number, as well as parents. Now, there can only be one of those numbers in the system, meaning that you cannot duplicate the cell phone number. There's an issue with cell phone numbers that we know that they are recycled. So sometimes someone has a cell phone number that's already in the system. If that is the case, they can skip providing their cell phone number. So if it is already in the system, they can just skip that. A cell phone number or a mobile phone number is not required in order to create a StudentAid.gov account. We recommend it because it makes verification easier, but it is not required. Okay? Email, yes. Phone number, optional. So this two-step verification is needed at the time that the student creates their StudentAid.gov account. And I'm saying student, but for anyone who's creating their StudentAid.gov account. So what's going to happen is when they create their account, they're going to go through the entire process of providing their social security number. They're going to provide other information like their address. They're going to set up their challenge questions. And then at the very end, they have to verify their email address. And if they've provided a cell phone number, they have to verify that cell phone number, and they can also set up an authenticator app. We recommend that they enable as many of these things as possible, so that when they go back to StudentAid.gov and sign in, which they're going to potentially do for years and years to come, that they have multiple ways of verifying their account and completing that two-step verification. If at the time the student is setting up their account, or an individual is setting up their account, if they don't have access to their email, they are not going to be able to verify their account, and they're going to have to start all over again. So we have a couple of locations where we do events, and some of these locations are, cinder block walls, and students literally have to go outside to get their email, or to receive the text to get the code on their cell phone. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you, for example, are in a location where maybe a portion of your school does not have good access to cell phone service, that is not the location where you'd want to host an event or you set up an account. You want to be sure that wherever that's being hosted or whenever anyone is setting up an account, they have good cell service and access to that email account that they used. Now, I know all of you are probably aware of this, but always just want to remind people that people can only have one StudentAid.gov account. Because it is tied to an individual's social security number, you cannot have more than one because we all only have one social security number. So once someone sets up an account, that is the account that they have. And if they can't remember their username or password, there's ways of retrieving those. But it's not like your Apple account. Like I have multiple Apple accounts because I have multiple email addresses. So it allows me to do that. But with this process, people can only have one. What that means is we have a lot of parents out there who might already have an account because if they created one a couple of years ago for an older student, they're going to use that same username and password to access StudentAid.gov. They can update them, but they're going to, those would be they've already got that account created. Or we are also finding that parents, many parents have student loans that they are currently repaying. So they've set up an account so that they can access their federal student loans. That username and password they use to access their federal student loans is the same username and password they will use to access their parent section of their student's FAFSA. Again, we only have one account. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go through this process with students and parents. Now, up until a few years ago, people who did not have a social security number could not create a StudentAid.gov account. So there was a different process. We won't go there. But now individuals who don't have a social security number can create an account. This is only for parents though. So for students need to be citizens or eligible non-citizens, and they need to have a social security number that's kind of like a regular social security number. And what I mean by that is not a social security number that was only issued for work purposes. They need to have a fully functional SSN, okay? So students have to have an SSN. There is a minor exception for students from the freely associated states. We've had some, I know, at Fort Kent, but I'm going to not talk about them today. Let's just for today keep it simple. And this is only applicable to parents. But let's say we're working with students who they are here in the U.S. and they were maybe born here in the U.S. So they're citizens, they have a social, or they become citizens and they have a social security number, or they're eligible non-citizens with a valid social security number. But their parents may not have all of that. And that's okay. Their parents do not need to be U.S. citizens or eligible non-citizens in order for the student to be eligible for federal student aid. Only the student has to be eligible. But they did want to make a process so that parents could complete the FAFSA online. And the best way to do that was to allow a parent to be able to create an account. So the process for parents who don't have a social security number is very similar, except that when they start their FAFSA, so we can see here when they're creating their account and they're providing personal information, we would all provide our social security number when we were creating these accounts initially. If you don't have one, you click here, and what it says to the individual is that if you don't have a social security number and one of these statements is true, you can create an account. So with the one we're looking at now is I'm a parent or a spouse of a student who is applying for aid. So they can click the box to say, I do not have a social security number, and they can continue with the creation of a StudentAid.gov account. Why they make this a couple-step process is because they don't want people who just don't have their social handy to do this. So they really want to confirm that this process is only for those who truly do not have a social security number. But once they do that, and they continue on with the process, it works virtually identical to what anyone else experiences when they set up their account, with one exception. When they get to the end, I mentioned a moment ago that the Social Security Administration has to verify someone's identity. If people don't have a Social Security number, that identity verification cannot take place. So the process that was built is that people who don't have a social are verified through TransUnion. So you might be familiar with this process. Maybe you've had it happen. I know when I if I want to get a copy of my tax transcript, what they will do is they will ask me a series of questions to identify or to verify that I am who I say I am. And so I have to do things like, what type of car did you have a loan on in 1994 or things like that. Okay. So if there's enough information on an individual who doesn't have a Social Security number to be able to ask them 4 of those knowledge-based questions, then they will see those questions, and if they can answer them, their identity is verified. What we found is that a lot of people don't have enough information with TransUnion in order to see those questions. So the way that it's working currently is if someone is not able to verify their identity, they can still go ahead and create an account and use that username and password to access their student's FAFSA. There was a period of time where they had to provide documentation via email, regular mail, of who they were, or via email. They stopped doing that for reasons we won't get into today. They've stopped doing that. So bottom line is a parent without an SSN can create an account. If there's enough information, their identity can be verified. But even if there's not enough information to verify their identity or they get the questions wrong, they can still continue with this process and use their account and complete the parent portion of the student's FAFSA. So let me know if you have any questions about that. Again, this was new a couple of years ago, so I know people are still kind of getting used to the fact that this is how it works. For parents, one more step here, for parents who don't have a Social Security number, even if their identity is verified through TransUnion, their tax information, because lots of these individuals, even if they don't have a social, maybe paying taxes, their tax information will never transfer from the IRS directly. So we haven't gotten there yet for me to explain how it does work, but just kind of put in the back of your mind that their information, their tax information will not transfer if they don't have an SSN. All right. Continue on just a little bit. So who needs a StudentAid.gov account? So every contributor to the FAFSA needs to have a StudentAid.gov account. They need to have their own StudentAid.gov account. So contributor was a new term a couple of years ago, and it does have a very specific meaning. A contributor is anyone who is providing information on the FAFSA and who is required to consent to having their tax information transferred from the IRS. So you're going to see what that process looks like in just a moment. So individuals will go ahead and they will consent to having their tax information transferred into their FAFSA, lives behind the scenes, as well as allowing the Department of Education to use their federal tax information and redisclose it to schools and other organizations in some cases. So it's anyone who needs to provide consent. That individual is going to need to have their own account. So every student is a contributor, not surprising. Every single student is going to have to provide consent, and every single student is going to need to have their own StudentAid.gov account. Now, other possible contributors are the parent or the parent's spouse or the student's spouse. So let's talk about when that is the case. So if parents are currently married and in 2024 they filed a joint tax return, it's still going to need information for both parents. So it's still going to require the adjusted gross income or total income for both of those parents. But only one parent will actually need to create a StudentAid.gov account. And the reason is because when that parent goes into the FAFSA and they're providing consent, because they're married and filed a joint tax return, they can provide consent on behalf of their spouse. So if I were to file a FAFSA for my kiddo, they're too old to do this now. For me, they don't need parent information anymore. But if they did, and if I was filling out the parent section, because my husband and I are married and filed a joint tax return in 2024, the information, I could provide consent on behalf of both of us. So my husband would not need to have an account and log in and complete anything within the FAFSA. He could create an account and he could do some things and I could do other things, but the reality is only one parent needs to have a StudentAid.gov account under those circumstances. Now, if it's a case where the parents are married, but in 2024, because that's our year of reference for the 26-27 FAFSA that's now available, if those parents are married but file taxes separately, which some married couples do, or if the parents are both the biological or adopted parents and they live in the same household, but they aren't married, so they can't file a joint tax return, then again, information for both parents is going to be required. The total income for both parents is going to be taken into consideration. And in this scenario, both parents would need their own accounts. So if you're married and you file taxes separately, you can go in and complete the parent section of the FAFSA, but you can only grant consent to have your tax information shared. The other parent, your spouse or other parent, if you're not married, would also need to go in and to provide consent to have their tax information shared. Okay. One more set of circumstances or one more scenario I want to talk about. And this is if the parents are divorced or separated or never married and they don't live in the same household. In that case, it's going to be the parent who provides the most financial support that's going to be the parent on the FAFSA. So let's just say parents are divorced, student gets, the vast majority of their support from mom. Dad provides some support, but mom's providing more than half. Then mom is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. Dad will not be the parent on the FAFSA, will not have to provide any information at all, and their income will not be taken into consideration if the parents are divorced. Okay? So mom is the parent who provided more than half support. So mom is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. So mom, of course, will need her own StudentAid.gov account. Now, one more piece to this, though. If mom has since remarried, so if mom on the day the FAFSA is filed is married, then her spouse's information, including income, is going to be required on the FAFSA. Now, you can probably figure out where this is headed. The spouse won't need their own account they won't need to log into the FAFSA if they filed a joint 2024 tax return with mom. However, let's say mom got married over the summer. So it was impossible in 2024 for them to have filed a joint tax return because they didn't even know each other yet. Even under those circumstances, the spouse's information is required, the income is required. And because they didn't file jointly, mom cannot grant consent on behalf of her spouse. So stepdad is going to need to have his own StudentAid.gov account and log in and provide consent. Okay? I often get questions about this. So if you have them, please send them our way. Now, accounts can be created anytime. Earlier is great as long as people keep track of them. As I'm going to just restate it in case someone just joined us recently, account data must be matched with the Social Security Administration, but in order for tax information to be transferred. But great news, effective last month, that the match is happening in real time. Therefore, individuals can create their account and file the FAFSA immediately and have tax information transferred so long as it is available. Okay. We do have these worksheets available. We have one for students and family members who have an SSN. This is the first one here. We have a QR code that will take them to our website with instructions. This form is really meant just as a place where they can keep track of their username, password, etc. Information on the parents can be listed on the back. And then we have one for those individuals, those parents specifically that don't have a Social Security number. So those are available on our website, and I will include them in the follow-up email. Now, one other thought that I had is that I wanted to let you know that you can log in with a username. On the other hand, if you can't remember a username, you can use your verified email address or a verified mobile phone number as well. So there's actually 3 different pieces of information that can be used to log in: username, verified email, or verified cell phone number. Okay, so if someone can't remember their username, have them go ahead and try their email address and or their cell phone number, and then they'd have to put in their password. We'll get there in a moment, and they could access the site that way. So this is what the site looks like. You can see over here is where people would log in or create their account if they didn't already. As I mentioned, the StudentAid.gov site has all sorts of content on it. The FAFSA is here. You can access it by clicking here. Information on grants and loans, loan repayment, and loan forgiveness. So everything is all under this one umbrella site. It can be accessed from a phone. I still don't want to do a FAFSA on the phone. It's a lot easier than it used to be, but I prefer to use a desktop computer. That being said, it absolutely can be, and we know all sorts of people do all sorts of things on their phones. So if you click on menu, they've updated this recently. If you click on menu, that's where you will see the ability to log in or to create an account or to access the FAFSA. So all of this can be done from a phone. All right, water break. Mary, any questions related to?
No, there was just one quick question about both the student and the parent needing the StudentAid.gov account, which I answered, but no, I don't see anything else in the chat or in the Q&A. So just encouraging people to ask now. You've got Mila, so don't hesitate. Share your burning questions.
Absolutely. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into the FAFSA itself, okay? And we're going to do this with a dependent student. So I will say that a lot of things, I'm going to touch a little bit at the end about independent students, and I know some of you do work with independent students, so I'm not forgetting them, I promise. But a lot of things are very similar for independent students as they are for the parents that are married. So let me just say very briefly that if a student is married, their spouse's information is required to be on the FAFSA, and whether or not their spouse needs to have a StudentAid.gov account depends on whether they filed a joint tax return in 2024. So the logic of how some of these questions are answered are very similar for dependent parents as they are for independent students. But we'll talk more about them in a little bit. All right, so the FAFSA is a roles-based form, and we're now going into 3 years of the FAFSA being a roles-based form. So my guess is that you are all familiar with the fact that they really are segmented. The student has their section and sees their questions that are applicable to them that they answer, and the parent has their section that has different questions that are applicable only to them that they will complete. Either the student or the parent can start the FAFSA. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. And whoever starts it will invite the other party to complete their section of the FAFSA. This invite is what connects the student section and the parent section together. So I think as I go through today, hopefully that will be clear as to how that happens. But this is one of the places where, you know, kind of if you haven't done it a lot, it takes a little bit it took me a little bit anyway, to wrap my head around how this was working. So please ask questions about this. Federal Student Aid does recommend that the student start the FAFSA. So we're going with that because we do agree that I think that is the best way to do the FAFSA. Last year, here's another change for those of you who worked on FAFSAs last year. Last year, if the student invited the parent, the student would need to provide the parent name and social security number and date of birth, which was really problematic because most students didn't know that information or have it handy related to their parents. So they have updated the process this year and simplified it, and it's very easy now, as you will see in a moment, for a student to invite their parent. So that's what we're recommending. Of course, if the student isn't available, or the parent is insistent, they can go ahead and start the FAFSA. So either of those scenarios work, but we are going to recommend that the student start the FAFSA. So here is a walkthrough of the FAFSA when the student starts the FAFSA. So for today's demonstration, again, the student is the one that is starting the FAFSA. Now, one of the things that I want to just clarify is that there are multiple ways to getting to where people need to go when accessing the FAFSA. So students can either log in and they can, log into StudentAid.gov and then click on the FAFSA link, or they can click on the FAFSA link, which will prompt them to be logged in, or they can just type FAFSA.gov in their browser and it will take them directly here. So there's multiple ways to get to this form. So if the student goes to the FAFSA, you're going to see this is what the updated FAFSA form looks like. We can start a new FAFSA, we can edit a FAFSA, or accept an invitation. So we'll circle back to this one in a moment, okay? I do want to clarify that the 25-26 FAFSA is still available. So if you have a student who either is planning to go to school in the spring and has not done a FAFSA for the year yet, or you have a current college student you're working with who hasn't done their FAFSA yet but needs to, the 25-26 FAFSA is available. But I'm focusing on the 26-27 FAFSA, which will be, for high school seniors and anyone who's needing financial aid for the 26-27 academic year. And the other thing I want to mention before continuing on is just the fact that at this point, we know that the government obviously is shut down, but the FAFSA is still available and is still working. It's a very automated process. So, we're seeing a few little glitchy things, but we're not sure if those are attributable to the shutdown or just every now and then there are a few glitchy things. Generally speaking, things are going very, very smoothly. So people do not need to wait to do the FAFSA. They can go ahead even though we're in the middle of a shutdown. All right, so let's just say the student went and wanted to start their FAFSA, but they weren't logged in yet. The first thing they're going to log into StudentAid.gov. They have separated the username and the password. They're now on two different screens. So first they put in their username or their verified email or their verified phone number, and then they would put in their password. They can retrieve their username if they can't remember it, or they could reset their password if they can't remember that. So you can see under both scenarios, here they could, if they forget their email, phone number, or username, they can go through a process to retrieve that. If they forgot their password, they can go through a process to reset that. But guess what? If they do that, they're going to need to have access to that cell phone number and so that they can receive a code, or to that email address so they can receive the code to put into the system. That is why using an email that they're always going to have access to is so critical, and why we'd love it if they'd set up a cell phone number too, just because it gives them more options. If they get to this point and they've never done anything, the first step is that they're going to create their account. So just a reminder, I know I've said it a couple times, but two-step verification is required every time an individual logs into StudentAid.gov. I log into StudentAid.gov this time of year a couple of times a day. Every time I log in, I click on this here. This is actually the last four of my phone number. I click on this. I have to have that code sent to my text, to my phone, and then I put that in, and then I can enter the site. So every single time someone logs in, they have to have access and be able to enter that code to proceed. This does make it more difficult for parents to complete the student section of the FAFSA. I know we have parents out there. I was one of those parents probably that kind of just wanted to do everything for their kiddo. I will say I used it as a training, but I think I was probably a little bit that way anyway. But the process is really such that, best case scenario, the way it works is for the student to do their section and the parent to do their section. That really is the best way to approach this. All right, so then once they're logged in, they'll be taken to this screen, and they are going to indicate what their role is. So we've had the student starting the FAFSA, Alex, and so he's logged in, and so he's going to indicate that he is a student. If I was logging in as the parent, and I've logged in, and I'm going to complete the parent section of the FAFSA, I'm going to say I'm a parent. Now, keep in mind, a person can be both, right? So I could be both a student and a parent. So it's really important to think about what username and password did I log in with? Who am I that logged in? And what role am I completing as I'm submitting this particular FAFSA? Okay. So we would click on student here. The first thing the student is going to see is 4 onboarding videos. I've only showed you one here. they're going to see that the first time they start their section of the FAFSA. Federal Student Aid is actually contemplating getting rid of these because people they're finding are still opting out, but they are useful. So at this point in time, you are still going to see them. Then what the student is going to do is they are going to see their identifying information. This has pulled over directly from the information they provided when they set up their StudentAid.gov account. If they need to make a change to this, they cannot do it here. These are not editable fields. Instead, what they're going to have to do is I just recommend that they stop here, log out, or not log out, but go to StudentAid.gov, back to the menu on the top there, and click on settings and change their email address or any other information that they need to change. And then that will populate this correctly. Okay. So these updates can be made, but they can't be made in the FAFSA. They have to be made within the StudentAid.gov settings. The student will then provide their state of residence, and they will provide when they became a resident. These slides that you're going to see today were provided by Federal Student Aid, so they're not Maine-based in most cases, but it works the same way. The reason a student is asked as to where the date that they became a resident is because different states have different requirements if they have a state grant program as to when the student had to live in that state in order to be eligible. So that's why it's asking that question. Here in Maine, seems like the vast majority of kiddos I work with, they were born here and they've lived there their whole life. So it's just going to be their month and day of birth in that situation. All right, here is the consent page. So look at all this language, but this is the important page that the student sees where they will read through this, but consent to provide their federal tax information. That's even if they didn't file taxes, okay? By providing consent, though, what it means is that the student's tax information will be transferred into the FAFSA. Now, here's the weird thing. You won't see it because it's federal tax information and it's very protected. What you're going to see is that those questions related to federal tax information that was transferred just won't show up at all, but they're there. They live behind the scenes, and the schools themselves will get that data. Okay. I get a lot, probably that's the question I'm getting the most so far this year is, I didn't enter any tax information. Did I miss something? And I'm going to show you what people see, but I think they're going pretty quickly through it. And so they don't realize that their tax information was transferred and it is there. It's just not visible. So again, this page is quite long. This is the top part of it. And then here is the bottom part of it. Okay. There are FAQs with more questions if they want to check those out. Now, every individual has to provide consent. So every single student in this scenario has to provide consent. Again, even if they don't file taxes, because not only does this provide the IRS with the opportunity to transfer tax information into the FAFSA, but it also verifies that there is no tax information. And so that is a piece of information that is relevant and important as well. So every individual who's completing their section of the FAFSA has to provide consent by clicking approve. And if they don't, the student is not eligible for federal student aid. So the student will click approve. And then here's what they're going to see. And this is what people are missing sometimes when they're doing this quickly, is they will first see a slide that in many cases is going to say, we're securely importing your information. Don't leave this page, da, da, da. And it happens really quickly within seconds. And then they will get a screen that says that we have securely imported your information. And it doesn't specifically say that, it's not going to list it. But the first year of this process, they didn't even have this screen here. So people really didn't understand how it was working. So at least they added this. Now, again, the tax information is not going to show on the FAFSA, nor is it going to show in the FAFSA submission summary that students will be able to access after the FAFSA is filed. Okay. That's the old student aid report or SAR. Okay. So it's not going to show. But in this case, this was successful. So that's great. Now, sometimes it won't be successful. In a limited number of cases, the data could not be retrieved. And this could be for a couple of reasons. The most common is an inconsistent tax filing status and marital status. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the parent scenario, because that's usually where we will see this occur. If tax information was not transferred, but people did file taxes, then they will need to enter that tax information manually. Keep in mind that with the new better FAFSA, as of a couple of years ago, untaxed income no longer has to be listed on the FAFSA. So tax information is the only income related information that is needed now. That was one of the big simplifications with this process. Now, Mary, I'm going to move on and talk about the other sections in the FAFSA, but I'm not checking the chat. I'm trying to be focused. I'm not checking the chat or the Q&A. Any questions that we need to address before I continue?
Yes. The question was, if a student parent files an amended return, this import is pulling the amended return info, correct?
I do not believe it is. I'm going to check that.
If
that.
So if they amend the return before the IRS retrieval, would it, or is it just
Yeah.
if it happens after the fact that it won't?
I'm not going to answer either way because
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure. It seems logical to me that it would be the amended tax return information, but I almost think I read something that's making me hesitate to say that. So I want to do a little bit of research on that. I will include that in the Q&A or in the email when I follow up. That is one of those that my recollection is we were given one answer at one point in time and then the answer changed. So I'm just not confident. So, but I'll get you the answer on that.
Okay, great. And I think you might have the thing that you saw pop up in the chat was just someone who had shared the financial aid toolkit with the prototype to practice different scenarios. So that was just a share, not a question, in case you saw the little exclamation mark come up.
And I will show you where you can find that prototype at the end.
Perfect.
Okay, so now we're going to continue on and we're going to get into the personal circumstances section. So one of the things I want to call attention to is that, and sorry, these are a little bit blurry, but this is what the student sees. So you can see that the student has these sections to their FAFSA. When we get to the parent, you're going to see that they have different sections, fewer sections actually than the student does. Okay, so they can track their progress as they move through the FAFSA. So first of all, we can see that the student's marital status, they're going to indicate what that is. For today, we're going to assume that the student is single. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit as we move through the student section today is we're going to talk about the things that would make a student independent. So the scenario that we're going through here are students who are dependent. But the first thing that's already happened is that the student's date of birth meant that the student was not going to be 24. So if the student was over 24, they're automatically going to be independent. So for the purposes of today's scenario, we have a student, let's just say they're a high school senior, so they're currently 17 or 18. So they don't meet that 24 age cutoff to be independent. Additionally, we are saying that this student is single, never married. If I had a student that was 19 or 20, so they weren't independent by age, but if they were married, they would automatically be considered independent. So that's another piece of criteria that is looked at to determine dependency status. But for today, we are assuming that the student is single. So then the student is going to be asked about their college or career plans. They are going to list their year in school. The reason that this is important, first year, second year, or other undergraduate, isn't because this is how schools have some indication of what year the student is, and because their loan eligibility is tied to their year in school. And they may use it for other reasons, but at a minimum, their loan eligibility is tied to their year in school. So a first year dependent student eligible for $5,500, second year student $6,500, junior and senior years, they'd be eligible for $7,500. So that's one of the reasons why they're asked those questions. Used to break it down further, but now that's the only things that they ask. If the student indicated that they were working on a master's, a doctoral, or a graduate certificate, those students would be considered graduate students, and they would automatically be considered to be independent. So that's another thing that would make a student automatically independent. So far we have age, 24 or older, marital status, if the student's married, or if they're a graduate student, they're automatically independent. If they aren't any of those things, they are still on the dependent pathway. So for this screen also, they do ask if the student already has a first bachelor's degree. So for example, any student that's currently in high school, that's going to be a no. We get a surprising number of yeses on this though, but it does default to no. So that's a good thing. But let's just say you had a student who you thought should be eligible for a Pell Grant, based on everything you knew about them, but they weren't eligible for a Pell Grant. One of the things you want to have them double check is, did they inadvertently say yes to this question here? In most circumstances, if they said yes to this question here, they would be ineligible for a Pell Grant. Pell Grants are available for students who are pursuing their first undergraduate degree, specifically their first bachelor's degree, okay? So that's one thing just to kind of keep in mind. If you see a student that you're surprised that they didn't get a Pell Grant, make sure, confirm that they answered this question correctly. All right, now we get to a lot of the other reasons that a student would be independent. So this is the purpose of this screen here, is to determine dependency status. So the other reasons why a student would be considered independent is if they could answer yes to any of these questions. Answering yes to any one of these questions will automatically make them independent. So, for example, is the student on active duty in the U.S. Armed Services for purposes other than training? So National Guard, ROTC, these do not count. But if a student is on active duty in the military, they would automatically be considered independent. If they are a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, they are going to be considered independent. If they are supporting someone other than their spouse, and by supporting, I mean providing more than half of their financial support, and they currently do that and will continue to do that to the best of their knowledge through the award period of July 1 of 26 through June of 27, then they would say yes. So their dependents may be their own children. So if they have children, then they're providing more than half of their support, they would be able to be considered independent based on that alone. Another scenario could be that they are providing financial support to someone other than a child. Now, again, a spouse doesn't count, but let's just say we have a 22-year-old undergraduate who's a senior. They're not meeting any of the other criteria to be considered independent, but maybe they do have a sibling living with them, and maybe they are providing more than half of the financial support for that sibling. Then they can answer yes to this question. Now, no longer could a student who is pregnant answer yes to this question, because with Better FAFSA, one of the changes was that this now conforms with tax filing dependency status. So, whether or not you could claim someone as a dependent on the taxes, this definition is now in line with the IRS. So in the past, that wasn't the case. So people, a woman who was pregnant could be considered independent just because she was pregnant, but that doesn't work for tax purposes. So those things have aligned now, at least when it comes to dependency status. If a student, anytime since they've turned 13, was an orphan, so they have no living biological or adopted parents, they would be considered independent. If the student was a ward of the court at any time since turning 13, they would be considered independent. Or if they were in foster care at any time since turning 13. So I just want to make note of the fact that this is any time since turning 13. So if we had a student, for example, that was in foster care, and they were in foster care at the age of 12, 13, 14, but let's say at 15, they reunified with their parent, and they were removed from foster care. They went back to living with their parent because at the age of 13 or 14, they were in foster care. They would still be able to check yes to that box and to be considered independent. Their situations are probably a little bit perilous, and maybe could go back to that sort of a scenario. I think that's the logic as to why it's any time since 13, but I just wanted to call that out, that's critical, because it doesn't mean they are as of the day they filed the FAFSA. It was any time since turning 13. If a student was legally emancipated by a court in their state, they are considered independent automatically. Or if the student is in the legal guardianship of someone other than their parent or their step parent, as determined by the court, or they were on the day they turned 18, then they would be considered independent as well. Okay? So any one of those things is going to make a student independent. Schools may or may not request documentation of these circumstances. Many schools still do. They are not required to any longer, but many colleges still do want documentation to verify what their circumstances are here. And there are other cases where they absolutely do have to collect documentation. All right. So now let's talk about homeless students. And for the purposes of where we are in this presentation, I'm going to assume the student is not homeless. And that is because I'm going to talk about that under other scenarios at the end. But before moving on to the next slide, I do want to mention something important about this definition, which is in order to say yes to this, because we could have a student who thinks they should answer yes, but it would be a no because they're not unaccompanied. So you'll notice in the definition, at any time on or after July 1 of 25, for the purposes of this year's FAFSA, 26-27 FAFSA, was the student unaccompanied, and then we'll talk about the rest of it a little bit later. So if a student, for example, was living in a homeless shelter with their parent, they would answer no to this question because even though they are homeless, they are not unaccompanied. So I just want to raise that point for now, but when we continue on a little bit later, we'll go into greater detail about this question. But if the student is homeless and meets the criteria, they're going to be considered independent. For this one here, the student is not dealing with that situation. And then the same with unusual circumstances, which we used to refer to as a dependency override. There are cases where students could not meet any of the dependency criteria. Even though we went through a whole bunch of things that would make them independent, there's nothing that makes them independent. But they are in a situation where they cannot either contact their parent or it's not safe for them to be in contact with their parent. In that scenario, the student could say yes to this question. It's defaulted to no, but they could say yes. I just want to note that a parent unwillingness to complete the FAFSA or provide information is not considered an unusual circumstance. Okay, so we're going to dive into this more towards the end. For this point, we're just going to say, nope, this is a student who is able to get parent information and we're all good there, no unusual circumstances. So they are going to continue on and they're going to be considered dependent. Okay. So hopefully people feel comfortable with, what makes a student independent, because a lot of those difficult circumstances out there, a student is going to be considered independent automatically, meaning they can get this process completed much more easily. All right. So the student is saying, the FAFSA is saying, or not the FAFSA, but the logic behind it is saying, hey, you are dependent, you need to provide parent information. If the student cannot provide parent information on their FAFSA, it defaults to no. If they can't, there's a process we're going to talk about where they can get an unsub only. But for now, we're going to continue on because this student can get parent information. So then we're going to move really quickly through the next parts because these are very, very straightforward. The student is going to provide some demographic information. They are going to indicate what their sex is. This was a question that was changed back in February, went from gender to sex. It can no longer be skipped, and it can no longer, there's no longer the response of non-binary. So they have to answer this question either male or female. And it should align with what they are legally. All that. So then they're going to provide information on their race and ethnicity. So they'll answer what their race is, and then they can go into a little bit more detail if they choose to. They still do have the option of skipping this question. The student will indicate what their citizenship status is. So if they're a U.S. citizen, they will answer that. If they're an eligible non-citizen, if they click on this, then what they are going to see is another box will open up where they will need to enter their A number, which can be found on their, their green card or their immunization. That's an immunization. What am I trying to say? Immigration. There we go. Status. Brain cramp. They will fill in that A number. If they're not a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, there may be reason for them to complete the FAFSA, but they will not be eligible for federal financial aid or state financial aid here in Maine. But some states may still want a student to because they may be willing to in their state. consider them. They will list their parents' education status. This has no impact on financial aid eligibility for federal aid or state aid. Here in Maine, we do not have any programs that are specifically tied to how people answer this question, but there are some states that are looking for first-generation students and use this question to determine whether they're eligible for certain programs based on that. We don't do that here in Maine, but at the same time have the student answer that question correctly to the best of their ability. Now, this question is asking the student if their parent was killed in the line of duty, either while serving on duty as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces after 9/11, or as a police officer or law enforcement, firefighters, emergency service workers. The purpose of this question is if this student did lose a parent, in meeting this criteria, they will be automatically eligible for a Pell Grant, for a full Pell Grant, okay? Regardless of what the family's financial situation is. So that's the purpose of this question. Now, all of their other aid eligibility is still going to be based on that student aid index, or that SAI, the old EFC, that was as a result of all of the information on their FAFSA. But if they were in this situation, they would be eligible for a full Pell Grant. They will list their high school completion status. We're going to assume that the student has a high school diploma, but it might be that the student has a state recognized credential like a GED or a HiSET, excuse me, or they were homeschooled. If they were homeschooled, they are not going to see the questions that I'm going to show you momentarily, okay? But we're assuming the student graduated from high school. They are going to be asked to provide their high school. They can provide the state and the city or the name. They have to provide at least a couple of those, and then it will search and they will locate their high school from the list, and they will click on that and confirm and proceed through these questions. And then the student is going to provide their financial information. Now, if the student did file taxes, then they're going to have a couple of other questions. If they didn't file taxes, they're not even going to see the next couple of screens. If the student says, yes, I did file taxes, and assuming that their tax information did pull over automatically, then they will answer just a couple of questions. So even though their tax information came over, it will ask them, for example, did you have any of your income that was a rollover? Because if it's a rollover, they'd want to enter this information because it shouldn't count against them. So that would be if they rolled over retirement, because they changed jobs or something. So probably not applicable to most college students, but there are a couple of questions that get asked here, including if they had grants and scholarships, because if they had grants and scholarships or work study earnings that showed up in their income, that they need to list the amount of that so that it can be subtracted when calculating financial aid eligibility so that it doesn't count against them. All right, then we're going to get to the student's assets. The student would then provide their asset information as of the day the FAFSA is filed, so total cash, savings, and checking. They would list any net worth of any investments they have, including real estate. We're going to go into more detail when we talk about the parents, or if they had a business or a farm. There's been some changes. Thankfully, we're back to the old definition of assets where primary residence and small family-owned businesses are excluded. So I'm going to talk about assets in more detail in that other section. But one of the things I do want to point out is that if the student starts the FAFSA, they will always see these questions. They will always see the asset questions. When I get to the parent section in just a moment, I'm going to let you know that in some cases, assets have no impact on financial aid eligibility. So I'll explain when that is the case. So if a student starts a FAFSA, they're always going to see these questions. But if their parent meet the criteria not to have assets included, that will be the student's asset information will be excluded. Okay, but they will always see these questions if they start the FAFSA before their parents have had a chance to answer their questions. And then the student will list their colleges. So they will list as many colleges as they would like to, up to 20. We recommend every school that's even potentially on their list. They can go back and add more later. So they will search for their schools based on whatever criteria, and then they will, select that school. And again, they can list 20. They can view information about them. They can remove them if they change their mind. So this section is pretty easy and straightforward. Now look where we are. We are at the end of the student section almost. And what you're going to find is it's at this point that the student is going to invite their parent as a contributor. Last year, it was much earlier in the process, but they've moved this invite to the very end of the student section. So the student will invite their parent. If they're not sure who should be a parent, they can click on this for more information. This is how simple it is to invite their parent now. All they have to do to invite their parent is to provide the parent's email address. That is it. No more name, social security number, date of birth, just their parent's email address. It will ask them to confirm that, and it will let them know that an invite has been sent to the person at that email address. Okay? They will see that they will confirm that this has been sent. And here's a key piece for this year. They will be able to see an invite code. So just kind of file that away for a moment, okay? I would recommend that when students are inviting their parents, they jot down this invite code. They may not need it, but I would have them copy this code, write it down, hang on to it, or in whatever way works for them, okay? Then all the student has to do is they will just finalize their FAFSA. They can review any of the questions that they were asked. They can change the answers to questions. They can change their contributor. Let's just say they had a brain cramp like I did a moment ago, and they realized, oh, I should have used this email address. They can update that and change that. But then once they feel good, they're going to click on continue. They're going to see this long thing basically saying that they're telling the truth and that they are going to only use their money for the purposes intended. And they will be able to click on this box and sign their FAFSA simply by clicking sign. They will get this screen that tells them that their submission is pending, that they have their contributor that still needs to provide information. A FAFSA for a dependent student cannot be submitted, it's not supposed to be submitted until, and the ability should not be there, until both the parent and the student have completed and signed their sections. All right, Mary, any questions that before we talk about what happens on the parent side?
Yes. The first one was an individual who said that when they attempt to add their phone number as the parent, an alert is displayed stating that the number is in use. Does it make sense to just leave it alone since the email is verified?
Yes.
Or is there an easy way to add my number or correct this issue?
No, federal student aid is aware of this issue, but for now, the workaround is simply not to provide the emails, the phone number. So if someone has gotten to the end, even, and let's just say they can't verify it. Maybe it's not that it's in use, but they can't verify it. Or they got to the question and it says it's already in use, just do not provide it. And then they will be able to continue, verify their email address, set up their account, log in using a username or their verified email address. So they'll still have options available to them. But federal student aid is aware, and I think they're trying to work on a plan to deal with this issue of recycled phone numbers. Just in case you're wondering, this process of federal student aid accounts or FSA IDs has been around since 2015. So we're now 10 years in. So there are a lot of phone numbers in the system. But for now, just leave it out.
And then the other one, Mila, was just a comment back to the amended returns. Someone shared that they were researching that particular issue. And according to StudentAid.gov, it said that IRS data retrieval allows you to securely transfer an original IRS tax return, but not the Form 1040X amended return. If you file the Form 1040X, you might need to work with a financial aid administrator at your college or career school to ensure that any information you corrected on Form 1040X is reflected in the amounts transferred to your FAFSA form. So that was just confirming the latest that someone, Deborah Curtis, shared. Thank you, Deborah,
Thanks,
on that. So
yeah. That makes perfect sense to me because I think when I said it changed, I think we originally thought that whatever was on file with the IRS is what would come over. And then later we learned that if it was amended information, it would not. So thank you, Deb. That's really, really helpful. And that jives with what I thought I remembered, but it didn't quite seem logical, but it is what it is. Okay. Anything else?
that's all for now, Mila. Thank you.
All right, so now what we're going to do is continue with the scenario where it's a dependent student, where the student starts the FAFSA, and then the parent is going to complete the parent section. So when that student invited their parent, so at that very end section, when they provided that email address, here is what the email looks like that the parents received. So they receive an email that lets them know that their student started the FAFSA, has accept the invitation, and it has that invitation code. Okay. So in the perfect world, the parent is sitting there, they access their email, they see this invitation, and then they go ahead and they click on accept invitation. If they do that, what's going to happen first is they're going to be prompted to log into StudentAid.gov, assuming they were not already logged in. Okay, so they will click on that and they will log into StudentAid.gov. If they had not yet created an account, so the parent has just not been involved in anything yet so far, they didn't know anything about this, their first step when they open up that email and click on invite would, click on accept the invitation, the first thing they're going to do is create their account, which they can create and verify immediately and then proceed. But let's just say the parent in this scenario has created their account, they got the email, they accepted the invitation. Then they're going to see this slide here. And if they clicked on accept the 2627 FAFSA invitation in the email, it's going to automatically pre-fill their invite code. It's going to do it for them. Okay. So that's going to be the simplest way to get that code filled out. And in a moment, I'm going to show you what they see after they did that. Now, let's just say the parent didn't have the email, or let's just say they got the email, but they can't remember how to get into their email account, right? In that scenario, if the student wrote down the invite code, another way, like I said, there's many ways to access some of these things. Another way that they could do this is the parent could go to StudentAid.gov, and I know it's not very clear here, but under FAFSA form, they could click on accept a contributor invite. And what that's going to do, it's going to take them to that slide, that screen we just saw. Or they can just go to the FAFSA form and they could click on accept an invitation. So easiest way is click on accept an invite in the email, but even if they don't have an email, as long as the student noted what that invite code was, then the parent will have it available and can enter it even if they don't have access to the email. So again, all of the options take them to this same page where their invitation code will either be filled in automatically or they will enter this invitation code. Now, this is a big deal because this is how the student and the parent section are linked together. So that invitation code that was generated when the student invited their parent, this is what starts the parent section of the FAFSA. So that's how behind the scenes, the student and the parent sections of the FAFSA get linked together. Now, when the parent can hit submit here, there'll be a pop-up that lets them know that they're accepting the invitation, reminds them who their student was, because maybe they have more than one student. And right now, the process is that if parents have multiple kiddos doing a FAFSA, each of those kids would have to do a FAFSA, and the parent would have to go in and complete the parent sections individually for each of those kiddos. Okay, so it reminds them who the student is for, who this is for, and so they would select accept. Then the parent's going to see those 4 onboarding slides. I'm only showing you the first one. And then they're going to confirm their identity. So this piece is going to look just like the students did. Okay, so they're going to confirm their identity. If they need to if they see something that's wrong here, like their address is different or their phone number has changed, they would go to settings back in the FAFSA StudentAid.gov menu to change that. They see the same consent form, so I'm not going to go into detail about this, but they would see it and they would accept it, again, because they have to, in order for their student to be eligible for federal student aid. So they would say approve. It would show them that their information was importing and hopefully successfully imported, just like what the student will see, but this is for the parent information. Now, in this scenario, as I mentioned when we were looking at the student stuff, it is possible that their information could not be retrieved. And that is typically due to an inconsistent tax filing or marital status. So let's just say, for example, I mentioned a moment ago when we were talking about contributors that if the student identified that their parent was on the FAFSA was their mom. Okay, so their parents got divorced, their mom is the parent on the FAFSA. Over the summer, their mom got remarried. So on the day that mom filed the FAFSA, she is married, and that's what she would have to indicate. But in 2024, let's just say she filed taxes as head of household. In that scenario, the tax information is not going to come over because it sees married, head of household. Those are inconsistent. They say, oops, something isn't consistent here. We're not going to transfer over the tax information. And in that case, people are going to have to enter it manually. Okay. So you could see that, probably you won't in many cases, but that is usually the reason why. Parents will then provide their demographic information. In this case, we're a married couple. They're going to list their state of residence. And then we're going to get to the parent finances. I mean, look how short this section is for the parents, okay? There's only these sections. It's cool. So parents are going to see these questions about their whether or not they have any federal benefits that they receive. So a minute ago, we were talking about student assets. We talked about the fact that under some circumstances, assets are not required on the FAFSA. So if parents can answer yes, that they're receiving any one of these federally means tested benefits, or if anyone in their household is, then they would click that box and assets will be excluded. So in the case of parents, assets will be excluded and they won't even see the questions. In the case of the student, as I mentioned, the student already did their section, so they would have seen the asset questions, but their assets would be ignored under those circumstances. In the cases, even though that's not the way we're recommending it, if the parent did the FAFSA first and they have one of these benefits, students wouldn't see asset questions either. So just kind of think about the sequencing. But if a parent checks yes to this, even if assets were provided, they are going to be ignored. So again, it's anyone in 24, 25 in their family who received one of these means benefit programs. Now, to go back to almost 2 years ago in the nightmare scenario around free and reduced lunch is universal still in Maine. So just because a student gets free and reduced lunch does not mean they should check yes to this question. They should only check yes to free and reduced lunch if they qualify for free and reduced lunch based on the income thresholds, those poverty guidelines established by the federal government. Okay, so think about that when you're filling that out. If they do, they probably are eligible for some other. So you can check as many as you want, but just one is what gets assets excluded. So parents are going to provide their tax filing status. They're going to indicate, again, that they filed taxes with their current spouse. If not, again, they're going to have to enter some information manually. They will then see the family size, and the family size will be based on the tax return. So it's basically going to take the parent's marital status, 1 or 2, add the student in automatically, and then the number of dependents. If that needs to be updated based on the information, the parent can update this. So this would be scenarios, for example, where there's an agreement as to who claims the kiddos. So if parents are divorced, for example, they might have an agreement that 1 year parent A claims the student and another year parent B claims the student. The reality might be something different. So if the reality was that parent A, who's filling out the FAFSA, really truly did provide more than half support, they are going to list all of those individuals that they provided half support for, even if they did not claim them on their taxes because it wasn't their year. So that's where they would update that. That's a scenario in that might be necessary. Then they're going to list the number in college. As you all probably know, the number in college is not impactful in the way that it used to be, but people can still list it, so schools will be aware of it. There are, again, those couple of questions that get asked, even if tax information is transferred over. I do know that this is from last year, showing 2023 income. They did not provide this particular screenshot, so I just used last year's because there is not a change except to the tax year. If the manual pathway is required, then there are some additional questions that would need to be answered. Now, here's the parent asset slide. So if parents do have to provide asset information, so if parents were in a situation where they did not check yes to any of those federally means tested benefits, or the other time when parents could be exempt from providing assets is parents who earned less than $60,000 per year often do not have to provide asset information. It does depend on the schedules that they file, so I'm not going to go into the weeds about that. But there is a scenario where parents earning less than 60,000, even if they didn't have any of those means tested benefits, could potentially be exempt from providing assets. But let's just say this family's earning over 60. They didn't check yes to any of the federally means tested benefits. They would have to provide asset information. Because there's nowhere else to put this question, they put child support received in the asset question, even though it's not technically an asset. And when providing child support, people would want to list the most recently completed tax year. So like for right now in the fall, the most recently completed tax year would be 2024. Okay. So, but if people file much, much later, maybe it'd be 2025. So it's going to be child support received in the most recently completed tax year. Now, their assets are the same three boxes that they've been, but there have been some positive changes. Parents are going to list their total cash savings in checking as of the day that they're filing the FAFSA. They're going to list their net investments, excluding real estate, so they continue to not include the primary residence. That is excluded from the FAFSA, as are retirement accounts. Those are excluded from the FAFSA. What you may see here are non-retirement investment accounts, or you may, for example, have something like a 529, like a next-gen account. If parents have a next-gen account that they own on behalf of their kiddos, or even if their kiddos own it, then it's going to be listed as a parent asset, but they will only list the value of the 529 plan for the student for whom they're completing the FAFSA. So that's a change recently. So it's not the total amount of 529s they own, only the amount of 529s for that specific student. Where the change has come is that the current net worth of businesses and farms, we're back, what was old is new again. So we're back to excluding small family-owned businesses where there are fewer than 100 full-time employees. So that's a really good thing. Those businesses are again excluded as an asset on the FAFSA. After 2 years of being included, they are back to being excluded, as is the case with small family-owned farms. And they've added small fishing, family commercially owned fishing businesses, family owned businesses that are fishing. Whew, mouthful. Okay, so you're going to provide your asset information if you need to using that criteria. And then the last thing that's going to be needed is that the parent will provide their spouse's information. As you're going to see here, the only thing they have to provide is their spouse's birthday. And that's just another double check to make sure that in this scenario, the parents filed a joint tax return. So the one parent provided consent on behalf of the other. So the only thing that the other parent in this scenario needs to do is their birthday has to be provided just to make sure that it's consistent with the tax return. So they're just matching to say, okay, you said you filed joint taxes. Let's just be sure that your joint taxes is for a person that has that birthday that your spouse does. Okay, so it's just kind of a double check. In this scenario, the other parent does not need to have a StudentAid.gov account. They do not need to sign into the FAFSA and do anything, again, because they filed a joint tax return in 2024. So their income is being taken into consideration, but they don't have to log in themselves. Parents will then sign the will then sign the FAFSA. They will have a chance to review the questions. Note that they only see the questions in their section. They do not see their student's question. And when they click on continue, if they were the second, the students already signed theirs, they would click on the box here and they would sign, and you'll see now they have the ability to submit. Where the student only could sign because their parents' information wasn't completed, the parent can do both. They can sign and submit because the student has already completed their section. When the parent signs, they will see a congratulations screen. They do not have nearly the information that the student receives. students will get the confirmation email. This is the one from last year, but I think it's the same, where they will be notified that their FAFSA has indeed been processed, and it will estimate their student aid index. Okay, but parents do not get an email that provides the student aid index. It's really this transition, just like with the admissions process, that the schools and federal student aid are dealing directly with the student, not the parent. All right. Mary, do I have any questions before we continue on and finish up?
Yes, Miley, you do. And I think that's a good thing because I'll let you take a drink and breathe. It is so much information. Let's see. So this individual said I've been filling out the FAFSA, for my biological daughter for 3 years. Since then, I've remarried, adding stepchildren. My husband filled out the FAFSA late last year for one of his daughters who started college late last year. Should we continue to file separately or file the FAFSA together this year? We file taxes jointly.
Because if I've understood the scenario, when you file the FAFSA, you will list your marital status as married, because on the day you're filing the FAFSA, you are married. So you will say married. It will need information from both you and your current spouse, in the sense that it's going to use the income for both of you. If you filed a joint tax return with that individual for 2024, then you can provide consent on behalf of him, or he could provide consent on behalf of you. So you would not need to the other one would not need to log into the student's FAFSA, but their information, the total income, would be taken into account. If you did not file taxes jointly in 2024, your income is going to be needed for both of you, but each of you is going to have to log into the FAFSA and provide consent. And it may be a circumstance where you'll have to provide that tax information manually. Mary, you're muted. Sorry. You weren't muted. I'm sorry. I take that back. I just
sorry, no worries. So it's still 2 FAFSAs in the sense, one for each student.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
And
yes,
which is, I think that, and then in terms of the tax information, dad can consent for stepmom, mom can consent for stepdad. So hopefully that's answering the question that.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I missed the first piece of that. Yes. Every student has their own FAFSA.
Yeah.
So each of the students would start I would start it this way. Each of those kiddos, yours and his, would start their own FAFSA. They would invite their parent. Yours can invite you, his can invite his. But if you file taxes jointly, then only one of you has to go into the FAFSA, because you can provide consent on behalf of both as long as you file jointly in 2024.
You're amazing, Mila. Oh, goodness. All right. So then the other one, if my name is on another child's bank account who is under 18, I do not have to include that savings, correct?
If your name is, you would list it under whoever the interest income goes to. So if you're the primary, you would list it as a parent asset, which is actually beneficial. If you ever want to know which way you prefer to list assets, it's always better to list something as a parent asset than a student asset, because parent assets have less impact. Neither have a ton of impact, but parent assets have less impact. So that's why 529 is being counted as a parent asset. It's a good thing. But if you get the statement for taxes, it's going to be under your name, which is likely if they're under 18.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I have another home that my father lives in. It's not a rental. Do I need to claim the value of the home as an investment? So I'm reading that, assuming that the home is owned by the individual asking the question, but their father happens to live in it.
Yeah.
Do they need to claim the value of the home?
Yeah, this comes up, and I know this is a hard question, and people do not love the answer to this one. Yes, if you have your own home and you live in your own home, then the second property would be considered an investment property, even if it's your father's living there. And we know that people do that for all sorts of reasons. They might, have given the house to you so that they can have some of their, medical benefits and things like that. But the reality is that yes, under that circumstance, you would need to list the net worth of that other property. So again, it is the net worth, not the value. So you take whatever it's valued at, do your best to estimate that, minus any debt that's owed against it. The net worth would need to be listed. But I do want to reassure people that assets on the parent side do not have that huge impact in the same way that income does. Okay.
And then a follow-up to the savings account question, a parent who the savings account belongs to the student, but their name is on it because they were under 18. What if they're asking that question for a different student, not the one they're filing the FAFSA for? So they're filing the FAFSA for one student, but their name is associated with a savings account for their other child. Would
Yeah.
they report that as a parent
Yeah.
asset?
Yeah, technically, if they own it, they have to list it. If they own it as, even in their own mind, I understand that that's their other kiddos. If they are the owner of that account, they do have to list it, even if it's for the other kiddo.
Yeah. But in the case of a 529, unlike the old days,
Different, yes.
if that other child that they're not doing the FAFSA for, but it's a child that they have a 529 account for, in that case,
Exactly. So I had two kids back the way the rules used to be. I had to list the account, the value of both accounts for both
Right.
kids on both of their FAFSAs, but now that's not the case. So with the 529 specifically, you would only list the value of the 529 that's in that kiddo's account that you're doing the FAFSA for.
got it. That's all, Mila. Thank you.
All right. Okay, well, I think I'm going to go over a little bit. I extended it to an hour and a half, and I'm still going to go over a little bit. So bear with me. If you would like to stay, I would love you to stay. But I also recognize you have a lot going on, all of you. So this is being recorded, and I will send you the link so you can finish off the rest of it if you do need to leave me. But let's just talk about a few additional scenarios. If the parent starts the FAFSA, which is not what I think is best this year, it's going to work the way it did last year. So I'm not going to go into the weeds on this, but if the parent starts the FAFSA, they will provide the student's name, social, date of birth. The student will get an email, but it's more than an invite code. The student will have to log into the FAFSA where they will see a pending invitation and click on that. So parent starting the FAFSA works same way it did last year. Now, for independent students, they see all of the same questions as we saw when we went through the dependent student section, but they also see a couple more. So if they're an independent student, they will be asked about their family size and the number in college. So they'll have a couple of extra questions. Now, if that independent student is married, whether or not their spouse will need to fill out the FAFSA depends on a couple of things. So if they're married, their spouse's information is going to be taken into consideration, but their spouse will not need to log in with their own StudentAid.gov account unless they did not file taxes jointly in 2024. Okay. So if they were newly married, so they filed, their own taxes in 2024, then their spouse will need to create an account and go in and provide consent so that their tax information can be shared. Let's see. So now what we're going to talk about is the unsub only question. There are a couple that I told you I was going to come back to at the end. So this is the scenario where the student is considered dependent, doesn't have any unusual circumstances, but their parents are refusing to provide information and file the FAFSA. The student can say that they can change the answer to this question to yes. They're going to be, a pop-up's going to be seen so that they can confirm they really, really meant to do that. And in that case, the student can finish off the FAFSA themselves without any parent information, but they would be only eligible for an unsubsidized loan. That would be it. No Pell Grant, no nothing else. And additionally, there is going to be another statement that would have to be signed by the parent that they would get from their school. So it's not a great scenario. This is not what we ideally want for the student. But if all else fails, if nothing else is possible, then this at least would open up the opportunity for unsubsidized loans. Now I want to go just a little bit more into the homeless situation because there's kind of two scenarios with homeless students. So if we do have a student who is indeed unaccompanied, as I mentioned a moment ago, and is homeless or is self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, if they say yes to that, then what they're going to see is this screen here. And this screen is going to ask them if any one of these organizations or individuals can verify that. So, for example, what is very common with our high school students who are homeless is that their high school is already considering them homeless. And so their high school or school district liaison or their designee would be able to, they've already determined that, and if needed, would be able to provide documentation. The same thing if they have a director of a homeless shelter or something like that. So if one of these identified organizations or individuals have already determined that the student is homeless and could document that, then the student would say, yes, let's say in the case of the high school, and then they would automatically be considered independent. Now, the school may or may not request documentation of that, okay? But they are going to be considered independent and move through the rest of the process. If no one can document that, so we've got students, for example, who are, maybe they're going to school and they're now 20. So they've decided they want to go to college. They are indeed homeless. They weren't homeless in high school, or it was long enough ago that they can't document that anymore. So no one can document it. Then what they're going to do is they're going to indicate that no, none of these people or organization can document that. That determination has never been made. I've just been kind of living under the radar, and we know this happens. Then in that circumstance, what is going to happen is they're going to be considered provisionally independent, which means that or an unaccompanied homeless youth. Basically, for this scenario, they have to follow up with the school. So they can get their FAFSA finished and submitted, no calculation of their student aid index, and they need to talk with someone at the school so that they can verify their dependence or the fact that they are indeed homeless. They shouldn't be asking why they're homeless. They should just be determining that they are indeed meeting that definition of a homeless student. So they do have to follow up with the school. If they don't follow up with the school, then they are not going to be eligible for federal student aid. So that's a really important piece of the process. One very positive change, though, is that once a student is considered to be homeless, they are going to be considered independent in the subsequent year unless their circumstances change. So what we had was a scenario that was difficult for students who were homeless their senior year. Their high school had determined it, but in future years there was no one else was continuing to say that. But now that determination is being carried forward from one year to the next, as long as the student circumstances don't change. And then last but not least, as far as scenarios, if a student says yes to unusual circumstances, this would be a scenario where, again, it's unsafe for the student to be in contact with their parent, either physically or mentally unhealthy for them, or they simply cannot find and locate their parents. Then they could indicate that they have unusual circumstances. Often those are cases of abuse or something like that. Again, parent unwillingness does not meet this criteria, but if a student did have those really difficult circumstances, let's say one parent was never involved, the other parent maybe has passed on or is, maybe having some real mental health challenges or something, other challenges where they're just not reachable, then the student could indicate this. They too would be considered provisionally independent and would have to follow up with the school. And in that circumstance, they absolutely would have to provide documentation of their situation. Students would write a letter about their circumstances and need probably 2 independent non-family members to document what their situation is. But in that case, which we used to call a dependency override, if the school approves it, they would be considered independent after that documentation was provided and approved, and they would continue to be considered independent the rest of the way through their career, and they wouldn't have to document that each and every year. The FAFSA will be processed in 1 to 3 days. If the student logs back in, they're going to see that their FAFSA has been processed. They're going to see under My Activity, kind of the status tracker. They're going to see a link to their FAFSA submission summary. and they are going to see that they can take additional action. So this is what the student sees when they log back into StudentAid.gov with their username and password or verified email or phone number. Their FAFSA submission summary has 4 categories. We do recommend that the student print their FAFSA submission summary to a PDF so that it's easily available to share if requested. For example, the Worthington Foundation, as part of their application for their scholarship, does require that the student provide the first page or the cover page of their FAFSA submission summary. So we recommend that they print that as a PDF so that they will have that available. Okay, 4 sections to the FAFSA submission summary. The first is this overview page. It gives them an estimate of what they might be eligible to receive, keeping in mind this is only an estimate of federal student aid, not going to provide any state or school information. So people panic, don't panic. This is only going to provide the federal aid. But down at the bottom, I made it a little bit bigger so you could see it, I'm sorry, is where you're going to see that student aid index. So that's why, like, the Worthington Foundation needs that first page, because that student aid index is needed to determine the student's eligibility to be considered for a Worthington scholarship, which is why we want them to say that. Then they're going to see their FAFSA questions. Again, you will not see any of the income information if it was transferred from the IRS. You're going to see that the schools that they listed. If they want to add additional schools, they can do that. That was under those action buttons when they were under, they clicked on their FAFSA. And they will see what the next steps are. Last year, this was in red with an exclamation mark, and it made people really concerned. Thankfully, this year they've made it blue, so it doesn't raise quite the alarm. It just gives them an understanding of some additional pieces that are helpful to have. And then last but not least, we do have FAFSA resources available on our website, famemaine.com/educators. Most of you are educators, but if you're students and parents, you can go there as well. That's where you will find it, famemaine.com/educators. You'll find the FAFSA prototype. You'll find all of these screenshots from today and more. There's 200 and some listed. You'll find the student aid indicator, excuse me, student aid estimator. I think I need to be done. You'll find our Tuesday tips, which is our monthly newsletter, as well as recording of all of our Wednesday webinars or our recent ones, as well as the PDF of the slides. We also have resources available for people creating a StudentAid.gov account. There is, if you go to famemaine.com/FAFSA, you will see a parent wizard, which helps people figure out who needs an account. We have tracking sheets that are available so people can keep track of their information. We have tips, and we have an FAQ as well. We also offer FAFSA support. We have FAFSA help sessions. We have some virtual ones taking place. You can find those at famemaine.com/events. We also can offer assistance via the phone. People can call if they have a question. They can send us an email if they have a question. And then I'm going to actually drop down to the bottom bullet first. We will also meet with individuals one-on-one. So if someone wants to set up an appointment with us, they can go to famemaine.com/contact, and they can schedule a Zoom appointment with us, and we can help them do their FAFSA or just answer questions or help them compare offers, whatever individuals need. And then last but not least, we'd love to have students and family join up to get texts and or emails from us. They can go to famemaine.com/join to do that. And I am sending a copy of this presentation, so you will have these links in that. And if they're in the class of 2026, either the student or the parent or caregiver of the student is in the class of 2026, we're going to automatically enter them into a drawing for one of 3 $1,000 scholarships, because we so badly want to be in connection with students and parents. We don't have any other way to get in contact directly with students and parents. It's why we rely on you all so much, unless they sign up to be connected with us directly. And then we also have a Facebook group called Paying for College, which is for parents and caregivers. And we'd love to have parents and caregivers sign up for that as well. If you are interested in tracking your student's FAFSA status, you can do that. Many of you are familiar with the FAFSA portal. Don't worry too much about it. New agreements need to be signed. Emails are coming for those of you who have participated in the past, and I'll be reaching out to those of you who haven't going forward. And that's what I had. And if you're exhausted, I'm sorry. I'm kind of feeling it too.
Thank you, Milo. That was
I hope it
great.
was helpful. I'm gonna stop
Very
recording
much
now, Mary.
so.